Warning, the following video is meant for educational purposes only and should not be taken otherwise. Apex Crime Lords does not encourage, condone, or glorify the actions of the individuals covered in this program. Viewer discretion is advised. Keep watching until the end to see what's next on Apex Crime Lords. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, a name that strikes fear into the hearts of law enforcement and rival drug traffickers alike. As the former leader of the notorious Sinaloa Cartel, El Chapo was once the most powerful and influential drug lord in the world, overseeing a vast criminal empire that smuggled billions of dollars worth of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana into the United States and around the globe. But El Chapo's story is more than just a tale of criminal success and wealth. It's a story of humble beginnings, ruthless ambition, and a cat-and-mouse game with authorities that went on for decades. It's a story of daring prison escapes, brutal violence, and the corrupting influence of a drug trade on individuals, communities, and entire nations. In this episode, we'll take a deeper dive into the life and times of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, tracing his rise from a poor farmer in rural Mexico to one of the most notorious and feared drug lords in history. We'll explore the inner workings of the Sinaloa Cartel, the innovative smuggling techniques that made El Chapo a billionaire, and the human cost of the global war on drugs. So buckle up and get ready for a journey into the heart of the Mexican drug trade. This is the story of El Chapo, the rise and fall of the king of the drug cartel. Joaquin Archibaldo Guzman Lorera was born on April 4, 1957, in the small town of La Tuna, located in the mountains of Mexico's Sinaloa state. He was the third of 6 children born to a poor family of farmers who struggled to make ends meet by growing corn and raising cattle. From a young age, Joaquin was exposed to the harsh realities of poverty and the limited opportunities available to those born into rural Mexico. He received little formal education, dropping out of school in the 3rd grade to help his father work the fields. But even as a child, Joaquin displayed a natural intelligence and ambition that would serve him well in his future criminal career. In the 1970s, as a teenager, Joaquin began to get involved in the drug trade that was quickly taking hold in Sinaloa. He started out as a small-time marijuana and poppy farmer, but quickly worked his way up through the ranks of the local drug trafficking organizations. He earned a reputation as a cunning and ruthless operator, willing to do whatever it took to get ahead in the cutthroat world of the cartels. In the early 1980s, Joaquin joined the Guadalajara Cartel, then one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in Mexico, under the guidance of cartel leader Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, known as the Godfather. Joaquin learned the ins and outs of the drug trade, from cultivation and production to smuggling and distribution, but the Guadalajara cartel was soon torn apart by internal rivalries and external pressure from U.S. and Mexican authorities. In 1989, Felix Gallardo was arrested and the cartel split into several smaller factions. Joaquin, along with his close associate, Hector Luis Palma Salazar, and Ismael El Mayo Zambada Garcia, formed the Sinaloa Cartel, named after their home state. Over the next 2 decades, under Joaquin's leadership, the Sinaloa Cartel would grow into one of the largest and most powerful criminal organizations in the world, with a combination of business savvy, brutal violence, and a vast network of corrupt officials. The cartel came to control a significant portion of the global drug trade, earning Joaquin the nickname El Chapo, meaning shorty, for his small stature and immense power. But as El Chapo's wealth and influence grew, so did the target on his back. He would spend the rest of his criminal career playing a high-stakes game of cat and mouse with law enforcement, even as he solidified his reputation as the undisputed king of the drug cartels. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and the Sinaloa Cartel rose to become the dominant force in the Mexican drug trade. Under El Chapo's leadership, the cartel expanded its operations and influence, establishing smuggling routes and distribution networks that stretched from the remote mountains of Sinaloa to the streets of major U.S. cities. Central to El Chapo's success was his ability to innovate and adapt in the face of challenges. As U.S. and Mexican authorities stepped up their efforts to combat drug trafficking, El Chapo and his associates developed new and creative ways to move their product across the border. They built sophisticated tunnels beneath the U.S.-Mexican border, some equipped with lighting, ventilation, and even a rail system. They concealed drugs in everything from fake cans of chili peppers to shipments of frozen shark meat. But El Chapo's rise to power was also marked by extreme violence and brutality. As the Sinaloa Cartel grew in strength, it came into conflict with rival drug trafficking organizations, sparking bloody turf wars that left thousands dead. El Chapo himself was known for his ruthless elimination of competitors and his willingness to use violence to maintain his control over his empire. At the same time, El Chapo worked to cultivate a network of corrupt officials and political allies who could protect and enable his criminal activities. Through bribery and intimidation, he secured the loyalty of police, officers, judges, and even high-ranking members of the Mexican government. This corruption allowed the Sinaloa Cartel to operate with near impunity, even as the Mexican government claimed to be waging a war on drugs. By the early 2000s, El Chapo had become a billionaire and one of the most powerful criminals in the world. The Sinaloa Cartel was responsible for smuggling a significant portion of the cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana that entered the United States, and El Chapo's personal wealth was estimated to be in the billions of dollars. But El Chapo's high-profile status also made him a prime target for law enforcement. In 1993, he was arrested in Guatemala and extradited to Mexico, where he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for drug trafficking and bribery. However, El Chapo continued to run the Sinaloa Cartel from behind bars, and in 2001 he made a daring escape, reportedly hiding in a laundry cart and bribing guards to look the other way. The escape only added to El Chapo's legend and cemented his reputation as a criminal mastermind. For the next 13 years, he would remain on the run, even as the Sinaloa Cartel continued to grow in power and influence. But as the pressure from authorities mounted, and as internal rivalries within the cartel began to take their toll, El Chapo's grip on power would start to slip, setting the stage for his ultimate downfall. As the leader of the Sinaloa Cartel, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman sat on the top of a vast criminal empire that generated billions of dollars every year. But maintaining that power required a delicate balancing act, as El Chapo navigated the competing demands of his own organization, rival cartels, and the constant pressure from law enforcement. One of the keys to El Chapo's success was his ability to adapt and innovate in the face of challenges. As U.S. and Mexican authorities stepped up their efforts to combat drug trafficking in the 2000s, El Chapo and his associates developed new and creative ways to move their products across the border. They built sophisticated tunnels, used submarines and semi-submersibles to transport cocaine, and even experimented with catapults and drones to get drugs over the border fence. At the same time, El Chapo worked to maintain the loyalty and discipline of his own organization. The Sinaloa Cartel was a complex and hierarchical enterprise, with multiple layers of lieutenants, enforcers, and foot soldiers. El Chapo used a combination of generous pay, strict rules, and brutal punishment to keep his subordinates in line. Those who crossed him often paid with their lives. But as the years went on, cracks began to appear in El Chapo's armor. The constant pressure from law enforcement took a toll, as did the bloody turf wars with rival cartels, like the Juarez and Tijuana organizations. In 2014, one of El Chapo's top lieutenants, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, broke away to form his own faction, sparking an internal conflict within the Sinaloa cartel. At the same time, El Chapo's personal life was starting to unravel. His marriage to his third wife, Emma Coronel Aispuro, a former beauty queen who was 32 years younger, made headlines around the world, but it also brought unwanted scrutiny and complications, as U.S. authorities targeted Coronel as part of their organization into El Chapo's criminal activities. Despite the mounting pressure, El Chapo remained the top leader of the Sinaloa Cartel and one of the most powerful criminals in the world. He maintained his grip on power through a combination of strategic alliances, ruthless violence, and a keen understanding of the shifting dynamics of the drug trade. El Chapo was known for his ability to forge partnerships with other criminal organizations, both in Mexico and abroad. He worked closely with the Colombian drug cartels to secure a steady supply of cocaine and establish ties with criminal groups in Europe and Asia to expand his distribution networks. These alliances allowed El Chapo to stay one step ahead of his rivals and to maintain his dominance in the global drug trade. At the same time, El Chapo was not afraid to use violence to protect his interests, and eliminate threats to his power. He was rumored to have been involved in hundreds of murders over the course of his criminal career, including the assassination of journalists, politicians, and rival cartel members. His willingness to use extreme violence served as a deterrent to potential challengers and helped to maintain his fearsome reputation. But perhaps the biggest key to El Chapo's success was his deep understanding of the economics of the drug trade. He was a master at exploiting the laws of supply and demand, and he was always looking for new ways to maximize his profits. Whether it was by developing new smuggling routes, investing in cutting-edge transportation methods, or diversifying his product line to include new and more potent drugs like fentanyl, El Chapo was constantly adapting to stay ahead of the curve. Of course, El Chapo's success also relied on a vast network of corrupt officials and a culture of impunity that allowed him to operate with near total freedom. He was known to have bribed everyone from local police officers to high-ranking members of the Mexican government, and he used his vast wealth to buy political influence and protection at the highest levels of power. But even with all his resources and strategic thinking, El Chapo was not invincible. As the pressure from law enforcement mounted, and as internal divisions within his own organization began to take their toll, the net began to close on the world's most notorious drug lord. The recapture of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman in January of 2016 marked the beginning of the end for one of the most notorious and powerful drug lords in history. After his arrest, El Chapo was quickly extradited to the United States to face a long list of criminal charges, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. The trial, which began in November 2018 in federal court in Brooklyn, New York, was a media sensation. Over the course of nearly 3 months, prosecutors painted a damning picture of El Chapo as a ruthless criminal mastermind who had fueled America's drug epidemic and left a trail of death and destruction in his wake. They presented evidence of his involvement in dozens of murders, as well as his elaborate schemes to smuggle massive quantities of drugs into the United States. For its part, the defense tried to portray El Chapo as a scapegoat and a victim of a corrupt system. They argued that the real power in the Sinaloa Cartel lay with El Chapo's partner, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and that El Chapo had been unfairly targeted by authorities. But in the end, the evidence against him was overwhelming. In February of 2019, after nearly a 3-month trial, El Chapo was found guilty on all 10 counts against him. The verdict was a stunning blow to the man who had once been the most powerful and feared drug lord in the world. In July of 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years and ordered to forfeit his $12.6 billion fortune. The fall of El Chapo was a major victory for U.S. and Mexican authorities, who had spent decades trying to bring him to justice. But it also raised difficult questions about the larger war on drugs and the role of the cartels in the global narcotics trade. Even with El Chapo behind bars, the Sinaloa Cartel and other drug trafficking organizations continue to operate, fueled by the insatiable demand for drugs in the United States and around the world. In the end, the story of El Chapo is a cautionary tale about the perils of greed, ambition, and the lure of easy money. It's a reminder that even those powerful and ruthless criminals can eventually be brought to justice. But it's also a sobering lesson about the human cost of the global drug trade. As El Chapo serves out his life sentence in a maximum security prison in the United States, the legacy of his criminal empire lives on. The Sinaloa Cartel, under the leadership of Ismael El Mayo Zambada and El Chapo's sons, continues to be one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the world. And the cycle of violence, corruption, and addiction that El Chapo helped to perpetuate shows no signs of slowing down. The case of El Chapo also highlights the deep-rooted challenges that Mexico faces in combating the drug trade and the power of the cartels. Despite the high-profile arrest of El Chapo and other cartel leaders, the underlying conditions that allow the drug trade to flourish, including poverty, corruption, and weak institutions, remain largely unaddressed. In many ways, the story of El Chapo is a microcosm of the larger failings on the war on drugs. For decades, policymakers in the United States and Mexico have focused on a strategy of prohibition and criminalization, pouring billions of dollars into law enforcement and military efforts to combat the cartels. But despite these efforts, the flow of drugs have continued largely unhindered, while the human and social costs of the drug war have only mounted. Critics argue that a new approach is needed, one that prioritizes public health, harm reduction, and economic development over punitive measures and militarization. They point to the success of countries like Portugal, which has decriminalized drug use and invested in treatment and prevention programs, as a model for a more humane and effective drug policy. But change has been slow to come, and the power of the cartels remains deeply entrenched. As long as there is demand for illegal drugs and a lack of economic opportunities in countries like Mexico, there will always be people like El Chapo, willing to risk everything to meet the demands and reap the profits. The legacy of El Chapo is a complex and troubling one. On one hand, his story is a testament to the power of ambition and the lure of the drug trade, and a reminder of the human capacity for violence and brutality. On the other hand, it is also a cautionary tale about the limits of a correctional approach to the drug trade, and the need for a more comprehensive and compassionate response to a problem that affects us all. As we reflect on the rise and fall of one of history's most notorious drug lords, we must also grapple with the larger questions that his story raises about justice, morality, and the way forward in the ongoing struggle against the global drug trade. The rise and fall of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman is a story that is both fascinating and deeply troubling. It's a tale of ambition, entrepreneurship, and the pursuit of a vast fortune, albeit through illegal and morally reprehensible means. El Chapo's journey from humble origins to the top of a multi-billion-dollar criminal empire is a twisted version of the rags to riches narrative that has long captured the public imagination. But it's also a story about the devastating impact of the global drug trade on individuals, communities, and entire nations. The Sinaloa Cartel, under El Chapo's leadership, was responsible for smuggling tons of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and other drugs into the United States, fueling an epidemic of addiction and overdose deaths that continue to this day. The cartel activities also contributed to a culture of violence, corruption, and lawlessness in Mexico that has claimed countless lives and undermined the rule of law. In the end, El Chapo's story is a reminder of the human cost of the war on drugs and the complex web of social, economic, and political factors that have allowed the cartels to flourish. It's a story about the failure of governments to address the root causes of drug abuse and trafficking, and the unintended consequences of policies that prioritize criminalization and punishment over prevention and treatment. As we reflect on the legacy of El Chapo and the ongoing challenge of combating the global drug trade, it's important to remember that there are no easy answers or quick fixes. As we conclude this exploration of the life and times of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, we encourage you to continue learning about the complex issues surrounding the global drug trade and the ongoing efforts to combat it. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the Mexican drug trade. We hope this video has been informative and thought-provoking, and that it has helped shed a light on one of the most pressing and challenging issues of our time. Until next time, stay safe and stay dangerous.